us and we would be teachable. We thank you as we look back over the couple of weeks for the truths that you have reminded us of and perhaps taught in a new way to us, and that the great truths which are embedded within your word, principles for living. And so we thank you. We thank you for what you've done in our lives and our minds and hearts, and pray that even as time is spent in preparing for an exam, studying, that you would, when the exam comes in just a little bit now, that you would give people the ability to recall. And our prayer would also be that in the process of going back over notes and trying to get stuff nailed down, that there will be things that stay with us that will be becoming a part of our thinking, part of our worldview, a part of our way of living here and now. And I pray, Father, that you would instruct us. We're amazed by the relevance of the wisdom literature, how well written, good 2,500 years ago, that in our day it speaks loudly for those who will listen. And so we do pray that you would bless each one. I pray that the things that we have learned we would know well enough so that we could not only do well in an exam, but we might also be able to, with clarity and accuracy, share it with others, that you will, in fact, in the days ahead, bring across our path. So we do commit the time to you, and we do pray, Father, that these few moments would be helpful. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, the sixth book in the collection that we have, the books of poetry, is that of Lamentations. And Lamentations, as we saw when we were concluding yesterday, is historically nestled into the last year and a half of Judah's existence as a nation before they were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in 586. And when you go through this, you got to remember that Jeremiah is sitting there in his apartment in Jerusalem, and it's hard to imagine what it would be like if, let's say you're a full year into this, which you probably are, getting awful close to the end of this 18-month siege. And what you are observing on a daily basis is just horrific. They're confined within the city walls. Food, they're running out of food. The people who used to be ordering out all the time, or they had their own chefs and they ate the dainty meals, and they're now scrounging around in garbage cans trying to find something to eat. And all the people you depended upon to give you leadership and direction, they're not doing that. And we'll see that reflected in the first part. You were to read, for your reading, to read Lamentations 1 and 2, and there's a lot in there which hopefully you'll be impressed by it. But it's good if you possibly can to try to put yourself in that situation and imagine what it would be like after 12, 14, 16 months of isolation because of a siege, and to watch, you're buying a donkey head for a pile of gold, because a donkey head is the only thing that's you can put in a pot to boil to eat. I mean, it's just a horrific situation. So we look at this slide where we ended yesterday, and we of course are in 586 when all of this is taking place. And we talked about the historical setting, but also the spiritual setting as well. And while the immediate king, like Zedekiah, who just wouldn't listen to Jeremiah, he had his fingers in the consequence of what happens, but it goes all the way back to Manasseh. This is what God said would happen. And just, and I'm hoping that next week when you're in the prophets, again, the challenge next week will be the same as the last couple of weeks. You're dealing with an incredible volume of material, and I'm not sure where the prof will sit down on what passage or what book or whatever. But Jeremiah chapter 7 is a chapter that probably has some real relevance to what's going on here in Lamentations. This is written actually before the siege, but God tells Jeremiah to go to the temple, and he's to deliver a message there. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, "Stand in the gate of the Lord's house, and proclaim there this word, and say, Hear the word of the Lord, all you of Judah, who enter by these gates. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words." Where do you think deceptive words would come from? I mean, who would be the kind of people that Jeremiah would be targeting here? Watch out for those what?
Like false prophets?
Yeah, false prophets, or even leaders who are out of step with the things of God. What are the deceptive words? This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. What does that mean? Well, succinctly, that what was going on is that the people had been told, look, sweat not what's going to happen in the future. One thing we know for sure is that God is not going to destroy his own house. He's not going to let some foreigner come in and overrun the temple. And so the temple had become a rabbit's foot, so to speak, for Judah. They felt God would never touch his own house. I mean, look what happened. Remember when Uzzah, they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and he reaches out and touches it. Remember the days of David? What happens to him? He's dead. And they understood the glory of God came into the temple and all of that. Now God, one thing you don't need to worry about, Babylonians are not coming into the temple. And what's interesting though, is that Ezekiel, who was back in Babylon now, but this is between 587 and 597 and 586, between the two comings, Ezekiel begins his ministry back in Babylon. And one of his visions that he had in chapter 9, 10, and 11 was a vision of the glory of God leaving the holy place, passing through the temple, out past the front porch, to the gates, to the gate of the temple on the east side. And then, in his vision, the glory of the Lord went down into the Kidron Valley, went up onto the Mount of Olives, and then the glory of God ascended into heaven. Why is that an important vision? Because it's telling everyone that God just moved out. This temple is no different now than the 7-Eleven down the street or any place else. God doesn't live there anymore. And so as the siege is imminent, the people are saying, don't worry about it. Whatever else happens, God is not going to destroy his own house. And by the way, do you remember what he did in the days of Hezekiah? Remember when the Assyrians came and how God destroyed them? Well, basically what Jeremiah and the prophets had to say is, you're not Hezekiah. You are not a man of God. But when it's all said and done, they simply would not listen to very definitive statements coming from God's prophets. The result, of course, will be the disaster that is recorded in Lamentations. And we want to do this rather quickly. The 2 Kings 23 and 24 passages are simply ones that where God says in the days of Josiah, even though Josiah is a godly man, I'm not going to withhold my judgment. It's time out on judgment. And as long as Josiah is alive, I will not bring judgment because he's a good man. When Josiah died, then you have the three losers come along after him. Then you have, or four losers actually. Then you have this ominous reality that Nebuchadnezzar is coming. And this, of course, looks at his third coming. So we come back, and I'm just going to walk rather quickly through and highlight a few verses out of Lamentations. But the lament, of course, is over what has happened and is happening and would happen to Judah and to Jerusalem. And the book really, if we were to give it a theme, is the idea of sorrow, grief over sin that has really come to the heart of Jeremiah. Let me just highlight a couple of things, and then we'll have to kind of wrap it up. Beginning with chapter 1 and verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. And of course, you think back to the days of David, and in that part of the world, there was no nation that could match Israel. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a forced labor. She weeps bitterly in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her among all her lovers. Now, the lovers are mentioned a couple of times. Who might these be, as Jeremiah is penning this?
Her allies?
Her allies. I don't think she had any. Well, yeah, the abandonment of other nations is a part of it as well.
Would it be, you said that certain people could still be saved, would it be the people inside the city still?
Well, they did that too, and they are highlighted, and we'll point that out. Okay?
So could it be false gods?
Yeah, exactly. Remember that the concept that runs throughout the prophets, the strange thing to our ears initially, is the idea of harlotry, and that Judah, Israel, Jerusalem are seen as harlots. They have been fooling around with all of these lovers, and what happened now? Her lovers aren't helping her, are they? These gods that they were having a kind of allegiance to, where are they now when we need them? And so she has none to comfort her among all her lovers. Her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. One of the things that, as I was kind of going through and rereading Lamentations, I was struck in a new way by how often this phrase, see in verse 2, she has none to comfort her. Down in the middle, towards the end of verse 7, no one has helped her. In verse 16, because far from me is a comforter. Verse 17 of chapter 1, no one to comfort her. Verse 21, no one to comfort me. And you go through this, one of the things that that you are struck with is the terrible sense of total abandonment and of isolation. You ever been lonely? We're not, that's a terrible feeling, isn't it? To be lonely. Even sometimes you're in a crowd and you can feel lonely. There's just nobody there that's relating to you. Nobody really cares what happens to you or cares about you in a particular situation. That's the way Jeremiah likens Jerusalem, this once proud princess, and now everybody's abandoned her, and the sense of isolation is overwhelming. But he goes on, and another thing that caught my attention was, let me just look down in verse 4, middle of verse 4, her priests are groaning. In verse 15, the Lord has rejected all my strong men. Verse 19, there's the lovers again. But my priests and my elders perished in the city. Chapter 2, verse 6, he has despised king and priest. And all of the people who ought to be giving leadership and help during a time of crisis have disappeared. They are providing zero leadership, zero comfort, zero hope. All the people you would depend upon. And so Jeremiah writes of the terrible situation, not just physically, but in every possible way. So, verse 8, Jerusalem sinned greatly, therefore she has become an unclean thing. Verse 12, is it nothing to you all who look and see if there's any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt out to me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce wrath. Verse 18, the Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his command. And that, of course, is certainly one of the themes, is the terrible guilt. This is not a fabricated issue. Jerusalem and Judah is facing what they're facing because of their sin. The second lamentation, it includes many of these elements, but is talking about the Lord's judgment. And again, you just go through in chapter 2, and by the way, we pointed out to you that verse 1, or chapter 1 has 22 verses, and chapter 2 is 22 verses. What's that again? Yeah, it's an acrostic based upon the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And so, this, by the way, the book of Lamentations is a book that's chanted at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, they prefer to call it, but in Jerusalem today. Verse 1 of chapter 2, I want you to notice the verbiage, and this is just a little bit of it. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. The end of verse 1, in the day of his anger. Verse 2, in his wrath he has thrown down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. Verse 3, in fierce wrath he has cut off all the strength of Israel. And in verse 3, and he is burned in Jacob like a flaming fire. Verse 4, he, at the end of the verse, poured out his wrath like fire. Verse 5, he swallowed up Israel, swallowed up its palaces, destroyed its stronghold. Verse 6, he has violently treated his tabernacle. And on it goes. Speaking of the very intentional judgment of God, and it's spoken of in the sense of his wrath, this idea that you have in the prophets of his white hot anger. You know what struck me about this? Not going to get astray on this. This is God's covenant people. These are the people that he has entered into a covenant relationship with the Abrahamic covenant. And they are not exempt from his severe judgment. And it occurred to me, the Lord has no such covenant with the United States or with any other Gentile nation. And if we believe that we can get away with flaunting unrighteousness in the face of God, and in calling, as Malachi will say later on, calling good evil and evil good, and declaring, where is the God of justice? That is, in other words, God really doesn't care anymore. He's sort of given up on the idea of truth and error, righteousness and unrighteousness, holiness and unholiness. That, you know, hey, God's really become sort of an American. No, he really hasn't become an American. And the idea that because we have been prosperous in all of this for so long, that somehow this is kind of like an eternal situation. It's not. God does not tolerate this with Israel. He's not going to tolerate it with any Gentile nation either. And history shows that. You can flaunt sin so long till finally a God who is incredibly patient and merciful finally says, that's it. That is enough. So you go through this. Notice down in chapter 2 and verse 7 where he says the Lord has rejected his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. Now Jeremiah doesn't go through the details like Ezekiel 9, 10, and 11 does. But the fact of the matter is God has moved out. So one of the things that it was true in Israel's history and all the way up to the end of Judah is chapter 2 verse 14. Your prophets have seen for you false and foolish visions, for they have not exposed your iniquity. One of the things that Ezekiel does, remember they're contemporaries. Ezekiel talks about false prophets, and so does Jeremiah. They have some of the most powerful passages, like Jeremiah 23, I think it's Ezekiel 18. Anyway, boy, if it doesn't sound like a lot of preachers today, one thing they do not talk about is sin. Everything is good. Everything is fine. We're not going to rebuke anybody for sinful living. No, we wouldn't want to do that. And that's what these false prophets were doing. And they were giving the people false hope. And they're the ones, the false teachers, false prophets, who have sort of extend the problem, and people don't therefore respond to prophets like Jeremiah. The third lamentation, which is the lengthy one. I'm just going to highlight what I think is just one of the great sections in Lamentations, one that's the most familiar verses out of Lamentations. Verse 19, remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. Well, what is it that causes Jeremiah to have any hope in this incredibly negative situation? The Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, which of course Lamentations 3, 22 and 23 is the basis of that. Well-loved, well-known hymn. The Lord is my portion, therefore I have hope in him. And so Jeremiah places his hope in the character of God, and of course standing behind the character of God is the Abrahamic covenant. And so Jeremiah, in spite of all that's going on, he says, I have hope because of the Lord's loving kindness. And that word loving kindness is the same word that's used in Exodus 34 when God reveals himself to Moses. It's a loyal love. And God is characterized by a loyal love, which is really, really, really good news for all of us. The fourth lament goes back to the Lord's anger and really some of the consequences of it. And to me, what you have in chapter 4 is some of the most dismal statements found in the book. Excuse me. It says in verse 4, the tongue of the infant, this is describing now, after all this period of time, the food is gone in the city, and I imagine bodies are stacking up everywhere, dying from malnutrition. The tongue of the infant cleaves to the roof of his mouth because of thirst. The little ones ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those reared in purple, which is a picture of royalty and breeding, embrace ash pits. For the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom, which is not just rhetoric, it is greater than Sodom because they're sinning in the light of knowledge. They understand the truth of God. Verse 8, sorry. Their appearance is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin is shriveled on the bones. On their bones it is withered. It has become like wood. Remember, we've all seen the videos and the still photos of Auschwitz and other of the death camps run by the Nazis, and you know our soldiers were struck with a slight bit of horror when the camps were liberated, and they see these people who are walking skeletons. How in the world they're still living is an amazing thing. Verse 9, better are those slain with the sword than those slain with hunger, for they pine away, being stricken for lack of the fruits of the field. And verse 10 probably is the worst of all. The hands of compassionate women boiled their own children. They became food for them because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. And apparently at the end of things, when all the donkey heads and anything possible edible was gone, mothers began to use their children for food. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Verse 7 of chapter 5, our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. And he goes on, but the book ends, the fifth lamentation ends. Thou, O Lord, dost rule forever. Thy throne is from generation to generation. Why dost thou forget us forever? Why dost thou forsake us so long? I'm sure in the midst of going through, can you imagine, 18 months of this, and no relief in sight, that the response is, Lord, why? Why are you not intervening here? Restore us to thee, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless thou hast utterly rejected us and art exceedingly angry with us. And Jeremiah, of course, knew that God was not exceedingly angry with them. Just a couple of things, we're not going to emphasize this or even go into it, but there are certain things that are highlighted theologically in here, and one is God's role as judge. It is true that God does not tolerate violation of law, his law, and men may think they get away with it, but God does act as judge. And when the time comes, if men do not deal with their sin, God will deal with them. There is hope, as we read, great is thy faithfulness, and the hope of restoration is a theme that's found in this book. And also, interestingly enough, those who are dancing on Israel's tombstone here are basically told God is going to deal with them. And when you recognize this, it all goes back to the Abrahamic covenant again. Why would there be any hope for a people who have sinned so completely and at such length of time? The answer is an unconditional covenant promises that God has made. Why would God care about these enemies of Israel? I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. It is all wrapped up with the reality of this covenant which God made with Abraham. You know, God is very clear from the get-go. Israel, it's not because you deserve any of this. God in his sovereign choice selected Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees. I have a friend who's Italian. She thinks that the Italians should have been the chosen people. Well, maybe she has a point. I don't know. You like pasta in the kingdom? Maybe so, you know. But God chose Abraham. And it's this covenant. You know, Israel has done grievous things. Not only will they end up killing or participating in the murder of their own Messiah, along with the Romans, but, you know, throughout the Old Testament, you have them thumbing their nose at God, turning their backs on him, going after other gods, violating everything God told them to do, and you think, you could have made a better choice somewhere along the line. But it's this unconditional covenant that guarantees Israel's future, not because they deserve it. So, the book of Lamentations is a real nightmare, but in it, embedded in it, are a number of theological truths, all of which, if you're listening closely, you can hear echoes of the Abrahamic covenant, even this time of judgment and distress. Well, I don't know. We had to hurry through it, but the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, it's got some profound stuff in it. Remember, let me ask you, what is the heart and the core of wisdom according to these books?
Fear of the Lord.
The fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the core of it. It's the beginning of wisdom, but it's that which dominates the idea that if you reverence, that you see God correctly, you will stand in awe of him. And then there's many, many wonderful results of that. And as you get familiar with the idea of the fear of the Lord, you can hear and you can see in the Psalms all the ways which God commits himself in a special way to people who reverence him. And we want to be that kind of people. And we get to fear the Lord because we come to understand what he's like, and that's found, you know, in one place. The other thing, and then we're done for, you know, that in going through this, I am always impressed, I guess, with Solomon's approach in the book of Ecclesiastes, and the whole issue of not going after mirages. What a futile way to live life, and yet the majority of those on the planet, and unfortunately, if Marna's right, the majority of believers in America too, are spending the days of their lives pursuing mirages, which is, as he points out, an empty way to live life. So one of the things that I would hope that you and I take away from this is that every now and then we'll sit down and think about what is the focus of my life? Where is the affections of my life? Because if our focus is on mirages, then that really is, in other contexts, is what the scriptures call idolatry. We're going after things. There's an affection, a loyalty in our lives, something greater than the Lord God. It's good stuff, and I'm glad we at least have a little bit of time on it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give the exam at 10 o'clock. I don't think the exam will take you long. It's mainly objective. So, I mean, you could be clear and clean and out there rolling around in the leaves by 10:45. Okay, you're free until 10. We'll see you back in here then.
You know I totally am, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, we should not. Yeah.
Now you're gonna get my survey of the Old Testament book.
I love students. Keep them creatures. They do carry disease, kind of like rats.
That's not
What?
That's not
Maybe.
It's possible.
It's possible.
Well, you know, public school teachers are always sick.
Something that I've got.
Little rug rats are carrying around all kinds of diseases.